All right, now we'll welcome our first speaker, Mike Korb, who is a past chair of the SME's Penn Anthracite section, just actually now includes this region as well.
Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it. I'm proud to be a 60-year member of SME and AIME. I just was wondering, you know, I got a gold pin for 50 years. I was wondering, do you give diamond pins for 60 years? Okay. Here I am on Lehigh campus. In 1961, I applied to Lehigh to be a mining engineer, and I got a acceptance letter back. I think it was probably in January, February 1961. I didn't keep it. It said, "Welcome to Lehigh University. We're glad to have you as part of the class of 1965, metallurgical engineer." I said, my God, who would want to be a metallurgical engineer? I want to be a mining engineer. So I went to Pitt. So this is the first time I've been on the Lehigh campus, although I lived in Bethlehem several times. I'm going to be talking today about the original 23 members of AIME. I know that we always everybody in this video talked about the original 22, but during this sesquicentennial year, a lot of people have done a lot of looking into things, and I think that probably George found out that there was 23, actually not just 22. And he used all my good stuff, so I'm going to be going a little bit deeper into something and probably do a little bit more than 22, 23, probably more like 70, 75. I have about 5.4 gigs of information that I'm going to try to do in 45 minutes. I'm glad to see that we started late so I can say, oh, no, you used up my time before. I'll use it now. Sir George has done some nice essays, and I hope if you haven't read them, please do. You notice I don't have one in the middle, and I don't know what the heck I did with that. I probably didn't read it. The Civil War was a very important time in the United States history. Besides solving the situation between the North and South and secession and slavery, it also changed things for us all. We had new innovation, technology, large-scale agriculture came out of it. The railroads started building railroads all across the country. In fact, just 4 years later, we put Transcontinental Railroad across. The mining industry also expanded during that time because of demand. Probably started going deeper, started expanding much more complex things. We needed technology. We needed new systems of pumping. We needed new systems of transportation. And we had to finally implemented steam power and eventually electricity. And if you take a look at all of the founders, I think that there were 7 founders that actually patented a steam engine. Also, many of our founders were veterans of that war. You can see out here, Rossiter Raymond, General Oliver, Percival Fraser, Arthur McClellan, Arthur DeSales, Robert Richard Ricketts, and Thomas Williams. By the way, only one of those guys was a Confederate. DeSales was from New Orleans. Ended up in Bethlehem. Paul Oliver actually was awarded the Medal of Honor. The founders of AIME were pioneers in American engineering. They expanded to collieries, mines, transportation, ironworks. They built railways, canals, developed mining schools, developed mine transportation, initiated, introduced new mining and metallurgy systems. They drove our industrial revolution and led to our national prosperity. They were really neat guys, and they were guys, of course. There's always been a debate about how many founders there were. There were 3 guys that sent out for the invitations to form the organization: Coryell, Rothwell, and Coxe. So I guess we got to call those guys the founders. In 1971, Coxe was 32, Rothwell was 35, and they had gone to college. They'd gone all over the world, to Paris, to Germany, and in the United States. They had been educated in all three countries. Coryell was an old guy. He never went to school. He was a practical engineer. And we still have a lot of those practical engineers that are keeping our society going. Coxe graduated from University of Pennsylvania. Like I said, he went to Paris, he went to Freiburg, spent time in England, Cornwall, Wales, other parts of Europe, looking at mining systems. He came back to the United States, and like I said, in 1970, he was 32 years old. He employed thousands of miners. He was a senator, an inventor. In fact, he holds more than 111 patents. Now, I got to believe that a guy that was 32 years old in 1971 died 30 years later, 20 years later, I'm sorry, probably didn't invent 111 things. I think he had a lot of guys working for him that invented it. They gave him credit for it. But anyways, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for his traveling great furnace, which was very important for the anthracite business. Back in 1871, you couldn't sell anything that was smaller than your thumb. Nut coal was the smallest thing that got sold. So everything else got thrown out in a pile. What we call culm was just dotted the landscape every place. There were big piles that ran into the river, washed down to Philadelphia. So that traveling great furnace really changed the industry. We started to be able to sell finer size coal, and really made the industry move. Coxe also was a humanitarian. He was a philanthropist. He gave money to Lehigh University. He started a school in Freeland, MMI, and his wife was a real do-gooder. Coxe was the president of AIME, and tomorrow, if you're going on a tour, we're going to drive by his house, the house that he lived in 1871. Also, we're going to visit Eckley Miners Village. Eckley is named for Eckley Coxe. The reason he's named for Eckley Coxe is because his third great-grandfather, Daniel Coxe, was the physician to Charles II. And he got a grant of about 2 trillion acres of land in the United States. You can see in this map here in the middle. I can't do this. Oh, maybe here. Yeah. The area from Virginia south all the way to the west coast belonged to Daniel Coxe. Charles gave land to everybody. He gave Penn some land in Pennsylvania. He gave other people land every place. And he gave Carolina about 3 different times. So there was a big dispute, and so they said, no, you can't have Carolina, Daniel Coxe. You could have New Jersey. So they gave him New Jersey. Over the years, he and his descendants did a lot of additional land speculation and trading of New Jersey for parts of New York, parts of Pennsylvania. And his great-great-grandson, Tench Coxe, the guy in the blue picture, was Eckley Coxe's grandfather. And Tench owned only about 1.5 million acres. Most of North Carolina, big parts of Pennsylvania, parts of Ohio, I think 7 states. And his estate eventually had diminished to about 80,000 acres at the time that Eckley came back from, before he went to Germany to study. And his father said, you know what, we're going to name a town for you. So we'll call it Eckley. Eckley, but now is Eckley Miners Village. This map shows pretty much what most of the acreage that was belonged to the Coxes at that time. You can see the dot in the middle is a couple places that we're going to be going on our field trip. The trip that we're going to be taking tomorrow also used to be done by stagecoach from Beaver Meadows to Wilkes-Barre, which is Wilkes-Barre, not Wilkes-Barre. Took between 6 and 8 hours to get there, 30 miles. In 1871, you can see the trip marked in yellow. We're going to take the trip in blue. It's going to be almost all through what the Coxe estate used to be. How am I doing? Bad. Richard Rothwell also was educated at Rensselaer, Paris, Freiburg, and he worked in Europe for a wire rope manufacturer. When he came back he was Canadian. When he came back from Europe, he came to Pennsylvania, to northeastern Pennsylvania, to Wilkes-Barre. He worked for Hazard Wire Rope Company. He also worked for Lehigh Coal and Navigation, introduced steam engines into the mines. Underground coal mines had steam engines in them. He did work for the Geologic Surveys of Pennsylvania. He was president of AIME in 1882. And we'll also see the house that he lived in. It's now a funeral home. Great story about Richard Rothwell. He was involved just 6 months after the AIME's founding, or 6 months, just 2 weeks, 3 weeks afterwards, at the end of May in 1871. There was a disaster in West Pittston where 34 men were caught in a mine fire, and 20 of them barricaded themselves in the mine. The other 14 died. The 20 men were rescued by Richard Rothwell, leading the people in because he knew enough about ventilation. Two other founders of AIME were also part of that. William Wynne Kendrick was the superintendent of the mine, and Thomas Williams was the inspector, state inspector at that time. Martin Coryell, like I said, he was a practical engineer. Most of his early career was, in general practice, he worked for Canvas White. He worked for Ariel Pardee, who was a classmate of Rothwell's at Rensselaer. But he also worked in several coal mines. He also worked in copper industry. His first connection with mining was in surveying in Pardee's Hazelton Company. In 1846, he went to the copper mining. We won't see his house because it's not it got torn down. His actual house got torn down. This is the house that he died in. It's in Lambertville, New Jersey. And you can may be able to stay there. From time to time, it's been a bed and breakfast. He was an early pioneer in the Lake Superior copper region. He was a second superintendent for the first copper mine in Keweenaw. Mine is Lake Superior Copper Company, and in 1846 he started the first stamp mill up there and made improvements. They actually mined 400 tons. I don't know, it must have been tons of improved ore, which they shipped to Boston. Going up there took between 21 and 28 days, depending on what kind of delays they had at the lakes. There was only one boat up on Lake Superior at that time. The shareholders, however, decided that they weren't going to give them any more money. I found the same problem with shareholders. They'd always think that the company should be started up a lot faster and get developed a lot faster than it actually should be, than it actually possibly can be. And so they said, "You guys aren't doing this fast enough. We're gonna pull the plug on you." So that he got brought back to Pennsylvania. And then we have to talk about Rossiter Raymond. Rossiter Raymond's office, he was the editor of E&MJ at the time, also was a consulting engineer. His company had done a lot of consulting for a lot of metallic mines. He also was a professor at Lafayette. His office in New York became the headquarters for the mining fraternity. At the February 1919 meeting after he had died, the Institute said, Henry Sturgis Drinker said, the president said, he was one of the most remarkable cases of versatility our country has ever seen. Soldier, sailor, engineer, lawyer, orator, editor, novelist, storyteller, poet, biblical critic, theologian, teacher, chess player. He was superior in each capacity. What he did, he always did well. You know, I'm not going to do any better than that, so we'll just not talk too much more about him. This is actually a picture that was published in Frank Leslie's magazine of his office. Looks like kind of busy office, huh? But one of the reasons that he was important was because he had, even at 32 years old, he was very influential in the community, in the mining community. And he published in E&MJ this thing that supported the AIME. So it's very important in starting it and getting a lot of acceptance. Another sidelight, he and Frederic Anton Illers, one of the other founders, and another metallurgist, were among the first tourists at Yosemite. Before Yosemite, at Yellowstone, before it became a national park. I'm going to talk a little bit about the original 2223. This is a picture of the veranda of the Wyoming house where the first meeting was held. Like I said, we always knew that there were 22 people, but actually Rossiter Raymond actually had revealed that there was actually 23 there. So maybe those 23 are the founders. Here are pictures of all the ones that I could find of the founders. So the meeting went on for 3 days. On Wednesday and Thursday, the second and third day, records show that there were either 45 or 46 other people that were voted in. Some of them didn't show up, didn't come to the meeting. They were represented. They joined, I guess, by Facebook. Yeah. This is what the screen looked like. Went back and forth between these two screens. Every time somebody talked, they'd flick it back and forth. Got pretty busy for a while. So they decided that they probably ought to have a meeting here in Bethlehem. Willard Ward also worked for E&MJ. And Willard Ward actually was Rossiter Raymond's boss because he owned the company. He was a Columbia School of Mines graduate. And he was he developed the first ferromanganese in Pennsylvania, in the United States at Diamond Furnace in Georgia. He also went on to be involved in a lot of gold and silver operations. He did pretty well financially. He was a yachtsman, owned about 14 different yachts during time. He did racing out of New York Yacht Club. He also met with stayed at President Cleveland's house a few times up in the Adirondacks. And he had a couple bungalows in Narragansett. You can actually stay in one of them for about $20,000 a week. It was rented last year before the pandemic. At the 50th anniversary of AIME, after the 50th anniversary of AIME, the Philadelphia section was founded. And Park, Willard, Ward, and Drinker were at that conference also. And like I said, I need to mention that Philadelphia section also is part of Penn Anthracite now. You've heard George talk about Henry Drinker and Thomas Drown. They were both presidents of Lehigh University. Drinker actually was a lawyer, and that was his main claim to fame. He was a lawyer for Lehigh Valley Coal Company. He said during his working career, he was I don't think that me being a lawyer much of a worker. But he became president of Lehigh after Drown died. Drown had been a chemist that taught at several schools before he went to Lehigh. He was president of AIME, secretary of AIME for 11 years. He was elected president in 1897. There's an excellent discussion. I won't dwell too much more because George is going to talk a lot more about Lehigh and these guys and AIME. Several other founders were academics. Justus Silliman was at Lafayette. He was also at Gettysburg. He was wounded and captured at Gettysburg. Some of the other academics were these four guys. I think probably were more than that, but in any case, these guys all were part of the academic group and I don't think any of them were at the meeting, except for maybe Hardin. So we talk about the great objects of the Institute was the greater safety and health welfare of those employed in industry. In April 1869, Pennsylvania passed the first safety law in the United States, where it just applied to Schuylkill County. 5 months later, the Avalon mine fire started. 111 people, 110 men and boys died in that fire. And I always felt that was part of the emphasis for the Institute. It was located just in Plymouth, about 4 miles from Wilkes-Barre, and so I thought that it probably was a big part of it. After the fire, miners from the area gathered to form rescue teams, especially Welshmen. The disaster was called a Welsh tragedy because almost all the victims were Welsh heritage, and most of them recently come from Wales. One of the founders of AIME, Louis Sylvan Jones, was a mine shop boss at one of the other mines. He was also a volunteer foreman of the rescue party. And I had an opportunity to put a new closure on the tunnel that was where they brought the men out over at Avondale about 7 years ago. Got a lot of publicity in the press, terrific publicity in the press. This is one of our problems. We get bad publicity in the press, but the mine fire and the disaster got a lot of press coverage. This is from the mine freeze, Harper's Weekly. So the press was in an uproar, so they passed a new mining law in 1870. And I think the law also was motivation for the Institute because it said that people really had to start doing things differently. Supplied wages for inspectors of mines. was a lot of politicking to get him, and one of the people that was a candidate was Joe Biden's second great-grandfather, Patrick Willard. He wasn't not a member of AIME. But Jones and he were candidates for one of the jobs. That's a picture of Willard and Jones. One of the board members was a member of AIME, and he voted for Jones, but still he didn't win because Willard was won because he was a Irishman. There already were Welshmen that were already mine inspectors, so we didn't want any more Welshmen on there. And like I said before, Thomas Morgan Williams was one of those people. He'd gotten a job pretty much for politics also, because he was a president and a very active in the Working Men's Benevolent Association, one of the predecessors of the mine workers. He also was a publisher of a newspaper, and he worked for one of the other founders of AIME. He was a Welshman also, came to the United States when he was 7. He worked in the mines and became boss of, later on, he was an inspector of mines, and he worked as a superintendent at Lincoln's Valley Coal Company. And he and Ariel Stearns, another founder of AIME, started the first underground locomotive in the United States. And that's a picture of that locomotive and Stearns. One of the other things that happened with the law in 1870 was it required mapping. Never had to have maps before. It had to be accurate. Many of the founders had extensive mapping experience, like Richard Simons. He did work for the Pennsylvania Survey. Henry Sturtevant was a map maker also. And the meeting down here in Bethlehem in 1871 had 10 technical papers. One of those was works of mines of Lehigh Zinc, which you'll hear in a while after I stop talking. But 4 were on surveying and map making. And one of those, Richard Rothwell, talked about the mines in Panther Valley and the mining seams there. And this is the picture of the map that he drew up. It was on my wall for about 15 years when I was working for Bethlehem in Panther Valley. That safety law also required much more precise measurements. And I remember when we first did mine surveying in school, we said the main thing that you got to remember is how far this is, how far this is, how far this is, and how many paces, how far you walk when you pace. Because that's the way most of our mine mapping is done. Well, that's the way it was done at that time. It certainly wasn't. I wasn't back there at that time, but one of the founders, Ogden Height, wrote a book about surveying of coal mines. Sidelight of that is that Ogden Height was probably the only founder that died in an insane asylum. There might have been a couple more. Eckley Coxe also designed and patented a plummet lamp, light plumb bob combination. He also invented the first miner's tape measure. And his surveys of his mines and the maps were called the most accurate of the extended surveys in America. Daniel Hoffman patented the transit that was able to look straight down and be able to, so that you were able to center it directly over spot. John Henry Hardin modified that. Thomas Spear McNair invented another transit, standard mine transit. He was also the chief engineer for the Jetto Mine Tunnel, which was considered an engineering marvel at that time. Mine tunnel that was dug from inside and outside at the same time came together at the same spot, which is pretty good engineering, I'd say, for 1870, 1880. It's an 8-mile tunnel. Today it drains about 60 million gallons per day from the mines. That mining law also required reporting. Before 1870, there was no reporting of any any real reports of production or anything else. But the best source of any of that information is by a book written by Samuel Davis Darrow. From time to time, you could buy it on eBay, or you could buy reprints of it. But it's called Coal, Iron, and Oil. It's basically talking about where oil was in Pennsylvania at that time. Darrow was from Cornwall. He and his brother-in-law, Jesse Beadle, opened a miner supply company in St. Clair, PA. He made miners' safety squibs, one of the things that they invented. The squib making was made there by, at one time it was all supplied squibs to everybody in the United States. About 90% of the squibs were made there in St. Clair. Frederic Mercur was one of the founders, and you gotta like a guy that had a locomotive and a ship named after him. He worked for Lehigh Valley Transportation. There was both a locomotive named the Frederic Mercur and a steamship, Frederic Mercur. And he also, a guy that had a obituary like this, Fred Mercur dead. He constructed the Lehigh Valley Railroad over mountains into the Wyoming. The commanding figure of Frederic Mercur will no more be seen on our streets. In his death, the community loses a sterling citizen and his company a superintendent whose place will not be easily filled. And in fact, they hired 4 guys to do his job after he died. This is my favorite guy. The only Frenchman in the bunch. I heard some bad talk about Frenchmen last night. But René Gaujot was a guy that came to France and went to Tumaco. I mean, everybody who emigrates from France goes to Tumaco, I'm pretty sure. He worked for the Little Schuylkill Navigation Railroad as master of machinery. He worked at the Delaware Copper Mining Company in Upper Peninsula. He started mines in Japan. He was Rothwell hired him as a superintendent of Canadian Consolidated Gold Mining Company, the Laurel Mine. He went to Williamson, West Virginia to buy properties for Coons Brothers and the Duke family. They had holdings in Mingo County and really started at Mingo Field. They had 8 children, 2 of whom became Medal of Honor winners, and 2 of whom became mine guards for the Felt company that started the mine wars in West Virginia. That's a picture of him and his family. I want to talk a little bit about James Thomas. James Thomas was a guy, I'm going through this list of all these founders, and there's all these people that I've heard of and I know of, and I get to this James Thomas, Wilkes-Barre. Now, who the hell is James Thomas? Well, almost half the members of AIME were immigrants. Most of those were from Wales. There were a lot of people that had come over from Wales at this time, in the mid-1800s. Pennsylvania coalfields had them. I figured James Thomas, he's got to be one of David Thomas's. Because both David Thomas and his son Samuel were also founders. As it turned out, he really wasn't. He was the grandson of he did work in the iron business, but in Alabama, not Wilkes-Barre, but it was not related. Followed a lot of leads other places. By the way, this is a picture of the remains of some of the workings up where Thomas was at. And I was kind of excited when we did this, because I found a genealogy that the piece of property up there that I thought it was my fourth great grandfather had sold it to him, but it turned out to be a different Beery. There were 120 James Thomases in Pennsylvania in the 1870 census. I finally found this James Thomas to be a guy who sold coal for one of the other founders. Shazam, I finally figured out who he was. This is who James Thomas is as far as I'm concerned. How am I doing? Okay. Talk a little bit about Bramwell and Peachin. They were two people that worked for Dunbar Furnace. They both had towns named for them over there. Another guy had a town named for him was Robert Christman Neal. He had a town that was about the same size as his house was founded for him. Hick was another founder that worked for Smoyer. James Timpson, probably the biggest thing that ever happened with him was he spent most of his life living in the Wyoming Valley House. Do I talk a little bit about Molly McGuire's? You got to talk about Molly McGuire's because you go from Pennsylvania. Film was shot in Molly McGuire's in 1968 was shot in Eckley, which looked like this at that time. They built a new breaker there for it. It's a picture from shot. Film was pretty much a failure, but we had one of the things that we do know is that several founders of AIME were involved with the Molly McGuire's. This is a picture of a threat that was sent to the Eckley, to the Coxe mining company. Simons worked for the second victim of the Molly McGuire's. A lot of reason for the Mollys became because of the mine ownerships. One of those people was Charles Parrish. And two of the victims worked for Dwight Zahner, who probably was the intended victim in both cases. I'm going to skip over most of the other guys. Hate to do it, but do want to talk a little bit about Arthur Bryce DeSales because he worked for the Zinc Works. Was the last superintendent at the Zinc Works, which is shown here on this map. You can see the yellow circles where the Zinc Works was. The yellow smaller circles where his house is, and the little red dot there is where I lived in 1968. This is the house that he lived in there if you're out for a drive. A little bit about Ralph Pompelli. He was one of the people that found the Gaujot Range in Michigan, Wisconsin. This is a rock from up there. It's not probably the rock that he found, but he's probably the most exuberant person in the bunch. He wrote books. He wrote what's called a children's book. Probably give your kids you read it to nightmares. But it's called The Travels and Adventures of Pompelli, mining engineer, geologist, archaeologist, and explorer. And William Blake, he was a member of AIME. He's also a member of the Mining Foundation of Southwest, like Rossiter Raymond is. Raymond and Eckley Coxe are members of the Mining Hall of Fame, as many of the other founders ought to be. Blake actually found some of the early oil deposits in California. I just need to talk a little bit again about Drinker. I have on your way in out there and on the table, there's a complete amount of this speech. Quotes that he made at the AIME Diamond Jubilee celebration in Wilkes-Barre in 1931. He said, I'm proud of the Institute, proud of its history and its record of accomplishment and of the growth of covering our whole country from that small beginning. Names of all of the members. When you go up to Wilkes-Barre on tomorrow, hope that you do get a chance to stop and see this other plaque that's in, marks the 100th anniversary, and also the building that where the 50th anniversary was held, Iron Temple. It still exists up there. That's the end of what I got. Thank you very much for having me.